first an explanation of the title, Playing with Blue Marbles. Of course, I think most of us recognize this image. This is from the NASA Apollo 17 crew's 1972 picture of our pale blue dot, our most beautiful and only Earth. But what if I told you that rather than one pale blue, in the world of games we have more than one, in fact an almost infinite amount of blue marbles to play with. It's much less like we have there's no planet B situation, and more rather like a crisis of infinite Earth situation. Because climate change in games is complicated, it's complicated to simulate, also complicated to make a meaningful gaming experience. So what I'm about to do here is to introduce you a bit of my work that I've conducted while at the Landhaus, and some of the future work that I'm in currently of pursuit. So even before arriving here, I was happy to note that we had Paradoxa's number 31 issue on climate fictions, in which I wrote about climate change in ecological Eurogames, and if you ever want to read it, just have a browse through the shelves at the RCC library. You will see it there. My work is informed by some of the work that I do on cooperative cooperation in science and technology action funded by the European Union, called Interactive Narrative Design for Complexity Representations, because I understand the climate crisis as a complex phenomenon that needs to be represented in interactive and digital formats, as well as cardboard. One of the things that I'm associated with, and that's what perhaps the Dutch connection comes in, is that I am on a project with Utrecht University's work on an upcoming volume on eco games, in which I write about some of the case studies that I'm bringing you here. And finally, I have also been commissioned to write about ecological games and simulated climate for the upcoming Palgrave Handbook of Intermediality, which hope I will also be able to send a copy to the RCC library. And I also submitted an abstract for simulation and gaming, which has a special issue on interactive digital narratives, in which I try to synthesize all of this work. And this is perhaps the kernel of what I'm about to do here, to get everything under the same roof. I think that a climate crisis is also a crisis of representation, and I was really reinforced when I reread Bruno Latour's work on agency in Anthropocene, because he says that in modernism people are not equipped to deal with the mental and emotional repertoire, deal with such a vast scale of events as the climate crisis. We are supposed to feel responsible for the whole Earth, and this call of action for us to change everything has a very different vibe to anything else that has been before in the history of our planet. He also calls it the planet becoming an agent of history, and he wants to write a geo-story. But the problem he has is that he is still trying to figure out how do we tell such a gigantic story. Classical narrative representations are struggling with the complex causality of the Anthropocene. I think that one of the suggestions is to look outside of the traditional arts and to think about how to play with nature in games, both digital and physical. How can games acknowledge the threat of global warming, asks Matt Barton 12 short years ago, 13 now. When game characters in digital games fail to take notice of a torrential downpour on their heads. This rhetorical question suggests that at least in a lot of the games, the weather events do not really change the mechanics of the game, they're just window dressing. Even more recently, a couple of eco-critical scholars have asked, although video games have a vast eco-critical potential, why don't we have so many climate change games? Where are all these ones? And it's a good thing to say that in a couple of years' time now, we've had a whole bunch of different representations who also take the climate crisis seriously. And one of the biggest volumes, Alanda Whitechunk's Playing Nature, has taken stock of these. And she said that ecology and environmental science offer compelling ways to understand game worlds. And besides, beforehand we had very metaphorical ways of understanding, like media ecology, or we talk about environmental storytelling some of the time. And I've also included this because I'm also interested in theme park design and how that influences the themes and representations of games. So environment can be a complex subject, but at the same time it has now been taken on with the urgency of the climate crisis. Some of the earlier classics include 1990's Sim Earth, the Living Planet, created by Will Wright of Maxis Interactive, and it is heavily influenced by the work of James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis. And there is even a scenario called Daisy World, in which you try to play and fiddle around with the planet as such. It's a very complex simulation for its time. Right now it looks very rudimentary, I guess, but it has been a trailblazer in how we understand the representation of Earth. More recently, grand strategy games like Civilization VI has released downloadable content expansion pack called Gathering Storm, which has climate mechanics involved, and you can in fact flood the planet and make it completely uninhabitable. New God games also try to fiddle around with the Earth, and they also have ways of mapping on the climate crisis, and one of the one is a game that is still in early access called the Universim, in which you are a god and you oversee a whole planet and you try to steward it onto a good trajectory, hopefully. There are more explicitly and overtly political games like Democracy 4, which I will talk about perhaps a little bit more, in which, you know, the climate crisis is just one of the things that your government has to manage, but it does impact you and your rulability in a sense that the environmentalists are a group whom you have to cater to. They have lobbying power. You have to arrange a couple of things in their favor so that they vote for you in the next elections. One of the most involved ones is called Fate of the World Tipping Point. This is innovation on the BBC Climate Challenge game that was created for 2009, and it, more than any other game here, is based on real science, which I will showcase a little bit later on. And finally, even big budget titles like The Sims 4 have now started catering to a more ecologically minded set of players. So right now we have an eco-lifestyle expansion pack in which you can change your whole neighborhood's eco-footprint and do all sorts of variously green and polluting stuff. But it seems like, you know, the momentum is now with gaming to connect all of us together and to take the climate crisis seriously. On the subject of board games, we do have things like CO2, a game by Vital Lacerda, a Portuguese designer, in which you try to manage an energy transition by being a capitalistic mega corporation who is trying to send their scientists to UN summits to create more innovative technology in which you can then use to exchange black polluting power plants to greener power plants. There's Keep Cool, Gambling with the Climate, another towards a more political way of understanding what a climate crisis can be. So all of the players there are leaders of big industrial nations, and they all have various lobbying agendas which they are trying to achieve, while also nominally also trying to save the planet. But it might not always be the case that they manage to do so. Tipping Point is a climate change card game about a city and its greening environment, and you are a mayor of that city and you're trying to manage the various groups of the city and support a growing population, both with energy but also trying to make sure that this energy is from a green source. Kyoto, Money Makes the World Go Down, puts you at the heart of the COP26 style climate summits, in which you might be, you know, in favor of the oil lobby, but at the same time you're also trying to take and keep all the wealth that you have gathered, while at the same time nominally trying to do something, but make sure that you have the most money in the end, right? So there are more sanguine versions of how to understand the climate crisis, not just optimism. And of course, there are also new games that are still in preparation. This one is about energy transition in New York City called Energetic. I don't know very much about it yet, but I've just recently seen this while preparing for this presentation. Oh, and of course, there's one final game that I really, really enjoy, and it's called Rescue Polar Bears Date and Temperature. Because if there is something that will be sure to motivate you to get the climate crisis sorted out, it's these porcelain bears who are floating on an ice floe and just waiting for scientists to rescue them. I mean, come on. You have to cooperate in order to save these guys. So the methodology that I use in my work can be, twofold. Both of them are relatively hermeneutic, so no structured interviews or any of that sort here. But I do what is called by Paul Booth, a noted game studies scholar, ludotextual analysis, in which both the textual elements of the game, the representational aspects, and the player actions and how you interact with the game are contrasted against each other to see what the underlying values of the game are and whether there might be a dissonance between the two. There's also ludic discourse analysis, which analyzes how meanings that are created via gameplay must function in a combination between the game system, the rules of the game, and how players determine what kind of rules are enacted, how they are enacted, and how the theme is being understood. So it is a much more like a reception-oriented one. Ludotextual analysis you can almost do if you've played the game a couple of times and then read through all the corresponding material. Ludic discourse analysis is a little bit more involved, I think. One of the things that games do that most other media don't do as much is to give players agency. Janet H. Murray says that agency is a satisfying power to take meaningful action and to see the results of our decisions and choices. And this is what you do. You experiment with the rule set of the game. You try different strategies, see what fits, see what brings you closer to victory, which scores the most points. How can I, defeat my enemies? But if everything goes to hell, you can still try again and try a different strategy. This is not something that we have with our planet today. And the climate crisis is particularly notable because it is one of those phenomena that it's so well modeled by scientists all across the globe that it lends itself very well to interactive representation. Just think about all the various climate models, simulations that are all going on around. This is also something that can be incorporated very easily into, modern computing and game models of various sorts. So, on to the case studies. The first one that I want to bring you is Fate of the World, because this underscores the last point very well. In Fate of the World, you are leader of a fictional organization called the Global Environmental Organization, and you recruit agents in various places on the globe. It is one of those games that game studies scholar Laura Obdebeke calls a new generation of God games, or Gaia games, very much in the way of Sim Earth in a way, in which humanity's impact on its supporting ecosystems is emphasized, called into question, and framed more ethically. What does that actually mean in terms of gameplay though? In a very board game-like situation, you have these meeple-like agents that you recruit with money, and then you can play cards. And these cards are growing in numbers, so it's a deck building element, as we like to call it. And you can influence the global policies of all nations that has the Global Environmental Organization hosting an agent there. And you can commit to different kind of energy mixes. You can have social programs such as educational reform. You can try to do shady government deals, like set up a black ops facility in case everything goes to hell and the global thermonuclear exchange happens. So there are various ways to influence these worlds, but the goal is technically to keep Earth under 2 Celsius and to also make sure that there is no global environmental catastrophe, no global economic catastrophe, and humans enjoy a high human developmental index. It's a tall order. It's a difficult game. It's also difficult because it is rather complex. It is one of the few games that I've had seen that has a bibliography. The Carpool Model in the game was actually published in Nature in 2009 by Myers, Allen, and their co-workers, and it also incorporates Menshausen's work on GHG emission targets, but these are just some of the stuff that is incorporated into the game. In the special edition designer notes, it functions as a developer's diary. You have a whole host of different reputable sources, and all of these are somehow represented within the game. Let me show you what I mean. This is a simplified model of the various things that the game tracks. It includes things such as happiness, technological level, quality of life, the amount of agricultural land that is being used, how energy is being produced, what are the services, the manufacturing goods, the exports, and so on and so forth. So these are all working under the hood, or to create some sort of like a regional emission model and a regional human development model. And these are all tracked in the game, and you can influence all of these in some fashion. But more often than not, even though it looks like you only play cards and that's the only kind of influence you have, more likely than not you're going to fail at this game, let's face it. Global financial collapse is almost inevitable, and it hardens your positions massively. It will come sooner or later. There are cycles involved in the game that ensure that. Also, temperature is constantly rising, and you can even, rise to 5, 6, or 7 above pre-industrial levels. And the game runs until 2200. You can just imagine the scope of this game, right? And a lot of people get really frustrated because they really want to do good, but they can't because there's so many variables to think about. Obdebeke says that the repeated experience of failure to meet the scenario's victory conditions shifts doubt onto the simulation itself for some people. They foreground some of these technological fixes as perhaps more optimistic than the proposed structural changes that we also need to take into account. So there's this kind of like a political critique that we can give to these climate change games, because mostly they are written by technologically minded people, and that also means that they are more likely to find a technological solution appealing. Build a spaceship, move to outer space, terraform another planet. And those are recurring science fiction scenarios that come to haunt us in game studies. Civilization is another game series that has been running since the 1990s, in which you play a civilization from the Stone Age to the Space Age, and you try to make sure that you are either culturally or militarily or scientifically dominant in the whole world. One of the ways that you can do this is that you can pool resource points and research together into developing new and new technologies on a technology tree, which comes from simple things like inventing mathematics to complex things like inventing democracy. And all those have some sort of like an in-game advantage for you. And there's a simulated climate model. So you are an emitter, because if you chop down trees to make them into some sort of like an industrial building, CO2 emissions will come. And especially during the industrial age, when you invent railways and steam travel and those kinds of things, CO2 levels will rise. But even if you play the greenest game ever, because you're not alone on this planet, but you have all the other civilizations vying for dominance, even if you have zero emissions, the planet will still heat up because it takes into account everybody's emissions. And that means things like, not just the global temperature rising, but the polar ice caps melt, sea levels rise, there are floods, desertification of towns. So that means that your productivity will also lose, and more frequent natural disasters occur. So this is just a little bit of a more detailed version of how this looks. So, and steadily it goes up and up and up, and you cannot revert climate change. So once you reach a particular stage, you're there forever at least. So it's a pretty grim future too, which includes things like tornadoes, typhoons, things that we already see from the news headlines today. And finally, moving on to the board games. We do have games like Vital Lacerda CO2, which you see here, and I guess perhaps I should also discuss a little bit about the fact that the inbuilt European Union works in a way that each region, once again, the regional view seems to be predominant in all of these things, because game designers recognize that different regions have different priorities, both in terms of energy and in terms of like social reforms. Right? So the in-game UN has different projects that are being let out, and these include things like reforestation projects, recycling projects, nuclear power plants, wind, hydrothermal plants, and all sorts of other renewable projects as well. And the way you do it is you create projects, prepare projects, and also finance them. So there is a cooperation between different players trying to model like how in real life energy projects you're also trying to cooperate cooperate across the globe. And even though you're working together, at the end, there's this slight bent that, someone will still be declared victorious at the end, unless you reach more than 400 parts per million, in which case everybody loses. So there's this tension between the cooperative and the competitive elements in these games wherever you go. Keep Cool is a much more competitive game in that respect. Very much like most other games, I guess you could say. You are playing as dominant world superpowers or upcoming powerhouses, and you're trying to make sure that your polluting power plants are being reduced by exchange for green power plants. And also you're trying to avoid natural disasters as well. However, your scoring will not be based on how well you do in avoiding these, but rather you have several lobbying powers. These are secret objectives that are hidden from the other players. You could be, for example, in the pockets of the oil industry. That means that you actually want to increase the amount of polluting power plants. Or you might be beholden to insurance companies, and that means that you want more natural disasters. So there is this tension once again, because some game designers seem to recognize now that, it's not all just a question of everybody holding hands together and singing Kumbaya, but rather we do have a whole bunch of economic incentives to perhaps drag our feet a little. And one innovation in Keep Cool in particular is the tracking of the global environment on a global temperature scale. There is a carbon emission permission market in here. So just like in later games like CO2, you are trading your carbon emissions with other players too. And if you reduce the number of tokens that you see on the pole up there, that also means that there will come more and more disasters as you are emitting more and more pollution. And these disasters are pretty terrifying. Coral bleaching in the Pacific, avalanches in the Alps, drought in India. And all of these things have a monetary impact on you as well, because you will need to finance the saving of the people as well. So the costs, the externalized costs, are once again internalized into the game mechanics. Kyoto perhaps is one of the most fun games I think I've seen, in which you're also playing, the USA, China, India, or the UK, or Russia, and what you have is wealth. Wealth is something that all have CO2 impacts, and they also have an impact on the natural world as well. So you have to give up these, at least some of these affluence cards, in order to stave off the effects of climate change. Every turn of the game, you draw a study, and then you place it in a little slotted dossier, in which you see the expected impact of the study. However, if you fail to meet the goals to prevent that, the disaster will not be what you actually see that has been projected, but rather something much more devastating that has been hidden by the dossier itself. So only one person knows the actual events that are about to occur, and therefore they can decide how much money they want to invest and how much affluence they're willing to give up in order to stave off these problems. However, people still lose together if there is a developmental crisis, or if there are mass extinction events, or if the global temperature rises. Once again, points are not being scored for just having the most money, but you also get oil lobby money, for example. You can get environmentalist financing, and so on and so forth. So there are also hidden objectives, once again. And this is in order to prevent the idea of everybody just collaborating together to build a bigger and brighter future. These paint a pretty devastating picture of how human politics are actually occurring at climate conferences and beyond closed doors. This is what you can see here is the study board, and this is the hidden object part of it. So once you slot this out, you can also see not just the expected damage, but also the actual damage. And then you flip all these blue tokens or the green extinction tokens, or any of the cloud parts. And if any of them are completely used up, then everybody loses. So what does that say to us about why do these climate change games work and how they incorporate all of these data. I think that one of the biggest issues here is that they use different kinds of scientific sources and they reduce the complexity of these scientific sources to a level that is easier to grasp, so that the main principles are there for you to toy and tinker with without having to worry about reading an actual scientific paper. But because they are algorithmic simulations, you do get the working principles, and because the rules are laid out in a law-like fashion, operating as natural law in the game world, you get to learn some of the cause and effect relationships that might escape you because the climate is a hyperobject, as Timothy Morton has repeatedly said. And this knowledge is being made accessible to the playing public. You can play this with your kids, you can play this with your group of environmental skeptics. It also connects the abstract descriptions of uncertainty related to our knowledges about climate change to that tacit knowledge of you actually playing the game and having to figure out, okay, what's my strategy here? How am I going to ensure that we are staying below 400 parts per million? And then it is a real life experience in the sense that, of course, it is within the microcosm of the game, but at the same time, the thought process that goes behind it simulates very much like the kinds of, cost-benefit analysis that real life, players would calculate during their own argumentation between, do I want to cater to the environmentalists? Do I want to cater to the oil lobbyists? How am I supposed to get these two on the same page? Finally, games also directly show the consequences of policy or individual decisions. Of course, these are constructed, so every game designer have their own ideas about what are the optimal solutions to the climate crisis, and this gives a +5 benefit, that gives a +10 benefit, and that means that there might be better or alternative strategies to beat the game, but this might not reflect what's actually necessarily the right solution in real life. However, it also exposes users to the different kinds of conditions, settings, and renderings of the future, so that they are objects to think with, in a sense that you can use these as tools for reflection about how we conceive of the climate crisis. These games allow us to present and calculate the effects of the user's current decisions, and also to weigh against what they envisioned the right solution would be, what the game says the right solution would be, and what, for example, real-world experts say the right solution is. So it starts to turn the wheels around in one's brains, and then perhaps they become a bit more attuned to the difficult positions that people have to sometimes take in order to do the right thing. And finally, simulation games also stimulate thinking about the long term in an experimental setting. Some of these games run to 2200, some of these games run far and wide into the future. And it's also something if we said that the climate crisis is a representational crisis, that's precisely because, as we have been bending around the notion of slow violence time and again. But what if you could reduce the time scale and to see it over the course of a 3 or 4 hour play session? Suddenly everything becomes much more visceral, especially in the case of a more realistic 3-dimensional representation of a future world in a computer game. You can perhaps start thinking about okay, this is a disastrous hellhole, how did we get here? And then you realize what the steps that we have taken to get there. And that would also engender another form of reflection. I could go on, and I have a lot more slides, but perhaps it is time to start the question and answer session, and then I can discuss a little bit more afterwards.